Thank you for joining.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम डॉक्टर साहिबा, कैसी हैं आप?
शुक्र अल्लाह का, आप ठीक हैं?
थैंक यू।
Should we start, sir?
आप अपलोड करेंगी, अपलोड करना चाहेंगी या?
नो सर, अभी थोड़ा तलावत हो जाए, इंट्रोडक्शन हो, उसके बाद फिर
ओके, बट होस्टिंग राइट आपने मुझे दिए हुए ना, सो आई विल रन द प्रेजेंटेशन।
हाँ जी, आपको को होस्ट कर दिया तो आप इसको शेयर कर लेंगे।
ओके, ठीक है, थैंक यू।
डॉक्टर फायदा, यू कैन स्टार्ट।
For smooth conduct of the webinar, I request all of you to please turn off your mics and cameras. Honorable guest speaker, dear faculty, staff and students, Assalamu alaikum and good morning. I, Faiza Azhar Khan, welcome you to this webinar on Budget 2021-22 and the IMF, organized by Department of Economics, Fatma Jinnah Women University, Rawalpindi. We'll formally start the webinar with the name of Allah, the Beneficent and Merciful. I request Ms. Aisha from BEcon 8 to recite some verses from Holy Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا زلزلت الأرض زلزالها وأخرجت الأرض أثقالها وقال الإنسان ما لها يومئذ تحدث أخبارها بأن ربك أوحى لها يومئذ يصدر الناس أشتاتا ليروا أعمالهم فمن يعمل مثقال ذرة خيرا يره ومن يعمل مثقال ذرة شرا يره صدق الله العظيم.
Jazakallah. Dear audience, today's webinar is the second webinar in the webinar series on Budget 2021-22 and is specifically organized to deliberate on Federal Budget 2021-22 in the context of the IMF. Federal budget for the fiscal year 22 was presented on June 11, 2021 with a total outlay of approximately 8.4 trillion rupees. GDP growth target has been set at 4.8%, while national PSDP outlay is set at 2102 billion rupees. No new tax is imposed on salaried class and minimum wage is set to be 20,000 rupees. Is this budget people friendly and what is going to be its impact regard to the IMF? This and many such questions are going to be answered in this webinar. Dear colleagues, it is our honor and privilege to have Mr. Sakib Sherani as the guest speaker for today's webinar. Mr. Sherani has wide-ranging experience in public policy, the financial sector, international capital markets at the corporate board level and in the development sector, as well as with the non-for-profit organizations and initiatives. Mr. Sherani has been a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council during different time periods. He has served on the EAC initially between 2004 and 2007, then from 2008 to 2010, and again from 2013 to 2017. He has also served as the Principal Economic Advisor to the Ministry of Finance, Government of Pakistan between 2009 and 10, and was a member of the panel of economists of the Planning Commission, Government of Pakistan during this period. He was also a member Revenue Advisory Council of FBR. Mr. Sherani is a noted commentator on the economy and has been an op-ed columnist for Pakistan's largest circulation English newspaper Daily Dawn since 2011. Sir, it is an absolute privilege to have you with us. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Sakib Sherani to deliver his talk. Sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Faiza, for the introduction, Dr. Bushra for the invitation, and to Fatma Jinnah, Women's University. It's always a pleasure to be here. As you indicated, I'll be talking about the budget in the context of what we had agreed with the IMF. So I have a presentation. Let me try and share that with you. So if you just give me a quick second. Right, so I hope this is visible to all of you, the presentation.
Yes, sir, this is visible.
Yes, sir.
Right, thank you. So basically, we'll talk about, obviously, no budget or any policy is without a context. So we'll start off with talking about the macro context and what that entailed. What sort of pressures that put on the budget, economic pressures or political pressures, but what it also called for in terms of fiscal consolidation and public debt sustainability. And then we'll take a quick, very brief look at the actual main parameters of the budget. We'll also have a quick look at how those deviate from the targets or the paths that we'd agreed with the IMF not too long ago, as early as March this year, or as late as March this year, so just a few months ago. How the budget deviates substantially or significantly from those IMF targets of conditionality, what the risks to the budget are, and what the risks from the budget are to the economy, and then very quickly what the outlook is. So the macro context, I think we're all familiar that Pakistan has had not a very stellar record of growth. Its growth performance has been fairly subdued in the last maybe 2 decades or so. At least about last 15 years or so. And it's been impacted by a number of factors. I won't go into all of them here, but of course we've been constrained by our balance of payments, and that's not let Pakistan grow sustainably for a long period of time. So the growth acceleration has been subdued and fairly short in the case of Pakistan. So we've had a number of episodes of balance of payment stress, and going to the IMF, which obviously has a standard austerity prism through which it forces member countries that go to the IMF for emergency assistance to follow stabilization or austerity programs. So that's where Pakistan has been. And then, of course, in 2018, we had a very large crisis. We went back to the IMF following stabilization, and then 2020. In fact, I spoke to you exactly 1 year ago about my outlook for what's going to happen to the world economy and Pakistan vis-a-vis COVID. Alhamdulillah, 1 year on, I can say that I was very, very wrong, thank God. I had a very bleak outlook then. So Pakistan did encounter a contraction, but a very mild contraction in economic output in 2020, 2021, and in 2020, sorry, and in 2021, we've seen a bounce back to about 4%. But nonetheless, if you look at this in a broader context, a big picture, a 5-year moving average will tell you that Pakistan is roughly making, its performance is roughly about 3.2% on average over the past 5 years, which is well below what the potential output should be for a large developing country like Pakistan, and what the required output is, growth rate is for a country like Pakistan. So this is obviously providing one pressure on policy makers or budget makers of why they want to transit from stabilization to a growth position. However, there are some constraints which perhaps have been ignored, and one of them is that Pakistan also has a very elevated level of fiscal deficit, especially over the past 3 or 4 years. And this largely is a result of not just a low tax to GDP ratio, but also because debt servicing as a percentage of GDP has increased very sharply, or as a percentage of the budget as well. And we'll see this in the next slide. So because of the high fiscal deficit, because of the high primary deficit, the public debt is on an upward trajectory, and very strongly or very sharply since 2008. Also since 2018, because of the rupee terms, has increased very sharply at just a shade below 25 trillion rupees. And if you look at it from another perspective, debt servicing as a percentage of revenue, which of course perhaps is the most relevant metric. So there are two variables here. One is gross debt servicing as a percentage of revenue. It's debt servicing as a percentage of gross revenue, and the other is debt servicing as a percentage of net revenue. So what is the difference? The difference is that, as you all know, under our constitutional arrangement, we are mandated to pass on a certain portion, agreed portion, from the federal divisible pool to the provinces as provincial transfers. So that is constitutionally mandated. So every other discretionary and non-discretionary spending from the federal government takes place after these transfers. So therefore, the really relevant metric to look at the impact of debt servicing on the federal budget is debt servicing as a percentage of net revenue, net of federal transfer to the provinces. Right? So here, if you see that in 2019, our fiscal framework was so out of whack that debt servicing was 103% of net federal revenue. It's come down quite sharply to about 77%, and the budget anticipates this will come down to about 68% or thereabouts. But the budget, as we'll see, is not based on very realistic assumptions of revenue. And if you adjust for that, then my prediction is, or my projection is, that in 21-22, the actual outturn will be that we'll continue to be not on a downward path, but on a slightly upward path vis-a-vis debt servicing. So we'll be around 79 to 80% as a percentage of net revenue, right? So this is really something which the budget has ignored, and will have a very important ramification for the medium term for Pakistan's growth performance. Now, if you look at the budget parameters, that was a macro context. Now, this is the budget as has been presented. Obviously, we'll make certain adjustments to this and try to make this more relevant and more realistic. in the next few slides. But this is the budget as has been presented vis-a-vis the budget for 2021 and the revised estimate or the outturn, the expected outturn for 2020-21. It's not completely finalized as yet, especially with regards to the fiscal deficit. We have not been given any indication from the budget documents, and this is actually something which where the budget has gone. The budget documents have gone back, have actually reversed the transparency of the past few years, and the budget format has been changed to make it even more opaque than in the past. So now we cannot work out from the budget in brief or from the annual budget statement what the fiscal deficit actually was. The budget documents only give us what the budgeted number was, which was deficit of 3,437, the federal part of it, and what the budget for 21-22 is, which is the federal part, which is 3,990. So this 3,913 is my estimate of what the outturn for 2020-21 has been, right? So it could be slightly off. We don't know at this point in time. So this is the budget of 2021-22 versus the outturn and the budget for 2020-21. And now, of course, this is, it doesn't tell us too much. What we really need to see is how realistic is the budget or the assumptions. Before we do that, we'll also need to see how the budget as presented varies with what we've agreed with the IMF as late as March this year, right? So the program came back on track after a 1-year pause. We sat down with the IMF and reworked the numbers, taking into account our growth performance, expected growth performance for 2020-21, the impact of COVID on the budgetary parameters for 2020-21. All that was worked out by the IMF, or reworked by the IMF. And 2 months later, or 3 months later, the budget that has been presented is significantly at variance with what we agreed with the IMF. And these are some of the main areas of the difference or the variance. FBR revenue, the IMF had expected us to collect 5,963. The budget aims for 5,829, but of course that is wildly optimistic, and I'll talk about it in the next few slides. The current expenditure as budgeted is almost 500 billion rupees or ₹500 billion higher than what we'd agreed with the IMF in March this year. The development spending, as you know, is about 273 billion rupees higher. And therefore, the fiscal deficit is 500 billion or 503 billion rupees higher than what we had projected. So we had agreed a target of 5.5% of GDP as fiscal deficit for 21-22 with the IMF in March, and the budget in June has a fiscal deficit of 6.3% of GDP. Of course, the actual reworked budget deficit is going to be even higher than this, and I'll talk about it a bit later. So this is already a significant variance with our agreed targets with the IMF. And of course, we have, we have to make adjustments and make the budget more realistic. And clearly, there are some, adjusters that we need to apply to the FBR revenue collection target that has been put in the budget. With a nominal GDP growth rate, expected, and a tax elasticity assumed of 1.1, we end up at about 5,300 billion rupees without measures. And with measures, we end up with realistic measures, of course, the budget assumes measures of 500 billion rupees, but already in the parliament, the finance minister has had to reverse some of those measures. And secondly, some of those assumptions were quite optimistic. So adjusting for this, we get a shortfall of about 300 billion rupees in the tax revenue. And then the petroleum levy is going to miss the mark. It's a very large expectation of the government of 610 billion rupees that they expect to collect from the petroleum levy. But for that, they'll either need to increase the per liter tax on petroleum products quite sharply, or they will need to increase petroleum prices across the board, or the volume of petroleum sales in Pakistan will have to increase by about 25 to 30%. And keeping in view, the likely outcomes for all those three, we think there'll be a shortfall of at least 50 billion rupees under petroleum levy collection. And then the gas infrastructure development cess has been over budgeted for the last few years since 2015 by at least about 100 billion rupees each year. And we think this is very likely to continue this year. A very large source of shortfall in the budget is going to be the provincial surplus. So the budget assumed provincial surplus aggregate provincial surplus of 570 billion rupees, and what the provinces have budgeted totals 127 billion rupees. Therefore, there's a very substantial shortfall of over 440 billion rupees from here. And in fact, if you look at what the provinces budgeted last year and what they delivered, so clearly they're not going to meet even this 127 billion rupees surplus. It's very likely going to be a deficit, combined deficit from the provinces. So this 440 billion rupees is going to be even larger at the end of the day. So there's some offsets which are available to the finance minister in the budget. One is the BSTP cut of about 150 billion rupees at least. And then expenditure saving, because there's so many items which the finance minister has kept allocations for, and we believe that he'll have to, he will have to roll back many of those, and probably by about 150 billion rupees. So a very realistic and a fairly conservative fiscal deficit that we estimate is going to be over 4 trillion rupees, right? Mind you, this is not in comparison to 3990. That is the federal fiscal deficit. And then if you add in the 570 billion rupees provincial surplus that the government is expecting, the overall fiscal deficit is 3413. So this 4 trillion needs to be compared with 3413. 3413 is 6.3% of GDP. 4013 is at least 7.4% of GDP. So this sets up a much larger variance with the IMF, right? And I'll talk about that in the next slide, but this is what the program with the IMF that we launched in July 2019. This is the path of fiscal consolidation that the IMF set out in that program, which the government agreed to. That's the second column, or the third column. And the second column tells you what the government has achieved so far. So the first year of the program in 2019-20, the IMF expected us to achieve 7.1%. We achieved 7.2%, which is not a large variation. In the next year of the program, in 2020-21, the IMF expected Pakistan to achieve a fiscal deficit of 5.4% of GDP, and we delivered 8.2% of GDP. 0.7% of this was thanks to COVID. So therefore, it's not, to some extent, the IMF would tolerate this up to about 6.1 or 6.2% of GDP. but we're off by at least 2% of GDP there. And then this budget delivers another 2% variation, at least, with the IMF agreed path. So there's a very strong, deviation from the path that we'd agreed of fiscal adjustment. I'll talk about this under the risks as well. So clearly, as I've said, the risks are not too unusual or fairly standard for the course for Pakistan for many, many years, where the budgets overestimate the revenue position and the overall resource position. And then they underestimate the expenditure requirements of the budget. And in this budget, a significant portion of the expenditure underestimation will come from the interest expense, because the fiscal deficit is going to be fairly larger. So the volume of borrowing will be larger. And also, because very likely at some stage, the State Bank of Pakistan will be forced to increase the interest rates because of the inflationary pressure in Pakistan and the pressure on the rupee. Therefore, the budget assumptions on the interest rate costs are on the lower side, so they'll need to be adjusted. So to offset that, of course, there'll be cuts to development spending and the announced incentives. Nonetheless, there'll be significant variation. Also, the budget has or introduces a significant risk on the balance of payment side, because it underestimates the balance of payments constraint in Pakistan. We have a high income and a low price elasticity of imports, and we have a low income and a low price elasticity of exports. Therefore, what has been estimated as the unconstrained growth in Pakistan, i.e., that GDP growth rate in real terms, which does not lead to a balance of payments crisis or a stress on the balance of payments, has been estimated at roughly 3.8% by the Asian Development Bank. My estimate is around 4 to 4.2% maximum. So roughly we're on the same ballpark. So the government has already delivered 3.94%, and it's targeting 4.8%. So well above that envelope. And then a second source of risk for the budget is international oil prices. They're likely to be significantly higher than what the budget has assumed. And it will have two impacts: that if these higher petroleum prices are on, then the government will need to absorb this in the budget and petrol. And finally, I think there's a significant deviation from the path of the public debt stabilization, as I've mentioned earlier. The debt stabilizing primary balance has been estimated at 3.2% of GDP by the IMF. The budget in FY22 at 0.7% deficit, but the actual is going to be, by my estimates, at least a deficit of 1.6% of GDP. So the public debt path is going to be on an upward trajectory in the medium term as well. Finally, last two slides on the outlook. So just to conclude, like I've said earlier, budget 2021-22 is at significant significant odds with the path agreed with the IMF. There are potentially three. One is that the government reworks the budget substantially to come closer to the fiscal consolidation path agreed with the IMF in March this year. The second part is, second option is a budget to the government to continue with the budget as has been presented. But this is, this is extremely unlikely, because the only way the IMF would relent would be under the US pressure and the US is very unlikely to allow the IMF to give Pakistan any latitude. We've seen that already. The US is fairly negative. The US political stance against Pakistan is fairly negative. Therefore, the most likely option, in my view, is that the program suffers an impasse, which it has to some extent, to a great extent. In September, I think the IMF will send its mission here, but it's not going to result in any breakthrough. And I think there will be a fairly long pause between Pakistan and the IMF under this program. I'm not sure if it will be derailed completely. For now, the IMF staff is insistent that they want Pakistan and the IMF to work out the differences. But I don't see these differences being worked out because the differences are fairly large. Also, the budget, as I mentioned, will spur imports and will cause stress on the external account, and is likely to be inflationary as well. So that is my short on the budget, and I'll be happy to take questions from the audience now. Thank you.
Thinking can be that what is going to be then the future of the fiscal sustainability for Pakistan, because the situation seems worrying, and then we are also expecting inflation in the future year also. Petroleum levy is also going to cause some inflation as well. So if you look at the fiscal sustainability for Pakistan, what will be your comment on?
To be honest, I think Pakistan faces a challenging situation for the next 2 or 3 years for precisely the reasons I mentioned in the presentation and you've highlighted just now. One, I think our balance of payments is not completely out of the woods. So the biggest risk that I see to Pakistan's growth performance actually comes from, for the next 2 years or 3 years, comes from the external account. And the path of public debt will play out, will exert its negative influence on Pakistan's economic performance and its growth performance in a slightly longer time frame, maybe 3 to 5 years. The biggest challenge is going to be two things: the external account vis-a-vis the budget, and in terms of economic performance, inflation. Inflation is already very high in Pakistan. And if you look at the global situation with regards not just to oil prices, but with regards to all commodity prices, they're extremely elevated. And the outlook for inflation globally as well, especially in the US, for example, is fairly negative. And I think Pakistan is likely to experience double-digit inflation in the next 1 year as well. So this is going to be politically very challenging for the PTI government as well, not just for the budget.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Bushra Yasmeen, you want to ask a question, please?
Well, thank you, Dr. Faiza. Sir, my question is about social protection program. We have seen in the budget that they have allotted huge money for now on the social protection program. So with the given budget constraints and the set variation with respect to IMF program, how will we cover that gap, and how we will be funding those huge expenditures on social protection program? Can IMF or other donors and other international organizations be of some help, or we have to do it at our own? And how will we be able to do this? I want some point of view of share on this.
So I think that's a very relevant question, because for the government, this social protection program is extremely important, not just in terms of providing a social safety net for people who've been impacted by the COVID situation since last year, by the the economic fallout of the COVID pandemic, but also as a political platform, because this budget really is an election budget as well. I think purely in terms of election strategy, you can argue that the budget makers were quite savvy politically, if not in economic terms, because they foresaw that next year, which would be the last budget for this PTI government, would be too late in political terms. So really, if they want to consolidate the political position, their thinking perhaps is correct that this budget and the next budget would give them enough latitude or enough space to consolidate the position ahead of the 2023 election. So in those terms, as you know, and the Prime Minister has made no secret of the fact that the SARS program is really one of the big flagship programs of this government. The government wants to be associated, has made an effort, has invested political capital in associating, in branding the SARS program as a flagship program of the PTI government. Therefore, I don't see any cuts in the allocations or the spending or the utilization for the SARS program. The government will actually make cuts, I think, in the PSTP allocation. That's probably because in terms of even purely in practical terms, we don't probably have the absorptive capacity to spend 900 billion rupees under the federal PSTP, and therefore I think we can make cuts of about 250 billion rupees at least. There, I think this 900 billion rupees, just judging from my own experience with the finance minister and with budget making in 2008, 9, and 10, this is probably this 900 billion rupees is for bragging rights. To be able to say that we've increased the budgetary allocation by 43%. Punjab is already harping on the fact that they've increased their provincial annual development program by 66%. These are bragging rights. They really don't carry too much weight, I think, with the electorate. But for governments, they seem to be important. But they provide a large cushion from which to cut, the budget allocations and make sure that the SARS program is protected. At least that's my view.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is from Ms. Seher, who is a student of AMECON 2. Her question is, what is the status of 6th review of Pakistan's reform program that's being supported by the IMF?
Right. So, as you know, this review was supposed to take place in July, early July, around July 5th or 6th, and has been pushed back simply because of all the reasons that I showed in my presentation, that the budget that Pakistan, so there are basically 3 reasons why the review has been pushed back. Pakistan, before the budget, Pakistan suspended the agreed conditionality or the reform path, if you like, with the IMF that we had agreed in March. So under that, the IMF was expecting us to increase electricity tariffs in 2 very large, 2 large increases. One of about 4 rupees and 50 paisas roughly in July, and then once again in September of 1 rupee and 50 paisas roughly. And even before the budget was announced, when this finance minister, the new finance minister came, he announced that he does not agree with that. Even the Prime Minister had publicly sort of said that we will not increase electricity tariffs. So that was the first disagreement with the IMF. The second one, of course, was in the budget. the budget, as I've shown you about 15 slides of how the budget differs substantially and significantly from the path of the IMF, the agreed path with the IMF. So therefore, this review has been postponed to at least September, the 6th review. And we're not sure if this will take place, but I think the review will take place, but it will not conclude successfully. Both the IMF and Pakistan will probably agree in September to continue negotiations, to continue discussions, which is a diplomatic way of saying that we do not agree at this point in time. And we expect Pakistan to come back with a stronger program stronger budget, more corrective actions. And at the various forums since the mid 2000s. I'm not sure, to be honest, how true it is, but if you look at the behavior of some of our policymakers in the past, and you look at the fact that many of us had actually forewarned that we are heading to the IMF. So we had forewarned in 2013, we had forewarned in 2014 and 15 that we are heading towards a balance crisis. We're heading towards IMF taking this summer. So he had actually said publicly that we will dial up the pain for Pakistan, right? So all these things were indicating that Pakistan's relations with the US are not good, and there are a number of ways that the US dials up the pain for countries like Pakistan, but certainly for Pakistan. One of them is that it makes sure that we head towards the IMF, and at the IMF, it makes sure either that we get a very tough program with conditionality, or Pakistan and the IMF do not agree. So the IMF does not agree to lend to Pakistan. So that's one way of using leverage on Pakistan. The other this time around was the FATF. The Financial Action Task Force conditionality was an additional conditionality on Pakistan, additional to the IMF. And for the first time, the IMF program contained meeting the FATF conditionality as part of its own conditionality. So it owned the FATF conditionality as well. So this was additional leverage on Pakistan, added leverage. And the causation is certainly there, that every time the US has applied pressure on Pakistan, things have happened from within Pakistan as well, where we've, our policymakers have sort of guided us towards the IMF and then have made us open to all these pressures from the US as well. So I'm not sure about the correlation, but certainly there's a, I'm not sure about the causation, but certainly there seems to be a correlation. These two things happen around about the same time. So that's the only thing I can say with any certainty.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is from Ms. Javeria Zulfikar, who is an MPhil student in the department. Her question is it possible that government can achieve set target of economic growth given the pandemic in mind as well?
Once again, a good, interesting question. There are two things happening. One on the positive side for the government's growth target, one on the negative side. First, the negative side. The negative side is not just the pandemic. You know, that actually Pakistan is very lucky, as we all know. There is, of course, a drag that is coming from the pandemic. We're not sure about the fourth wave. Clearly, there will be a fourth wave. Even the government is expecting that. There are some, very deadly variants now that are out there. The new variants, the Delta variant is Delta plus variants are now, in the past, and there are some new Lambda variants, etc., that are being talked about. So we're not sure, but it seems, alhamdulillah, by the grace of God, that Pakistan will perhaps not be impacted as much as other countries by the coronavirus pandemic going forward as well. What will probably impact Pakistan's growth rate is that we achieved 3.94% last year, largely on the back of an overperformance in the agriculture side. And that came from an overperformance in major crops. 4 of Pakistan's 5 major crops overperformed that one year. It's very unlikely to happen again. So this sets up a very high base effect for the performance of major crops in 21-22. And therefore, unless cotton really bounces from 6.7 million bales to something like 13, 14, 15 million bales, it's unlikely that agriculture will perform as it did in 2021. Therefore, it removes significant support for the government's growth target for next year. On the positive side, there is very strong momentum in the economy. We can see that in the services side, but more than that, we see that in industry, in large-scale manufacturing, etc. And that is likely to continue. So therefore, I think all in all, I personally see some risk to the 4.8% growth target. I think it's quite likely that the government will achieve something between 4.3 and 4.5%, but it's a bit early to say. But nonetheless, the bottom line is that it may not be too significantly far off from the government's 4.8% target.
Sir, I want to ask a question regarding the future of the pensions in Pakistan, because every public sector servant is concerned the pensions may not sustain in the future for this public sector employees. So what do you see is the future of pensions in Pakistan? Because we have heard a lot that there may be some golden handshake schemes for the current employees, and in the future the hiring will be contractual. So what do you see is the future for pensions?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very important question which gets ignored generally when we talk about budgets and we talk about Pakistan's fiscal sustainability, etc. You may recall that this actually, for the first time in Pakistan that I can recall for the last 20-25 years, this issue was flagged by none other than the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, maybe about 6 months ago, 6 months to a year ago, which is very unusual, but it also shows how serious this issue is, because really without addressing it, the debt servicing and pensions, because these are unfunded liabilities. So these two things are going to sink Pakistan's fiscal framework going forward. So the good news is that, both at the center and at the provincial level, certainly, I work with KPK on tax reforms. So they've worked quite diligently on pension reforms. I know Punjab has done a lot of work on pension reforms. The center is looking at pension reforms, and some of the things that you've mentioned, alluded to, moving federal employees into a surplus pool, freezing on new hiring as permanent, staff, and moving to contractual hirees, and setting up perhaps a sinking fund for funding pension liabilities going forward. These are some of the measures that are being discussed, are being evaluated, and are very likely to be implemented. So I'm disappointed. I'm glad you brought this up. It's a good question, because this is something I was looking for in this budget to be implemented, and doesn't seem to be the case. So maybe in the next few months, the finance ministry, the federal finance ministry may roll out some initiatives, but we certainly need some very strong initiatives as of yesterday to bring down the pension, the path of pension liabilities to more sustainable direction. And so thank you for asking this question.
Thank you very much, sir. Sir, the next question from a student, Seher. Her question is regarding the inflation situation in Pakistan. As she said, so far we heard that there is a risk that inflation could be more serious and more persistent than expected. And you also mentioned, sir, it can go to double digit. So I wonder, what is the evaluation from the IMF on the inflation in Pakistan? What can be the worst case scenario?
So if this is the same Seher who asked a question earlier, she's the only student who's actually asking questions or taking notes or listening to the webinar. So good, Seher, well done. If that's the same Seher. So I think it's a good question.
Yes, sir, it's the same Seher.
So she's a diligent student. So I think, like I mentioned earlier, both in the presentation and in the question, in responding to a question, I have a very negative, very pessimistic view on inflation, both in Pakistan and in globally for the next 1 year. And I think the IMF, of course, normally is normally behind the curve, because. And there are two reasons. One of them is a very practical reason. And this is something I'm saying from personal experience dealing with the IMF in 2008 and 9. So policy rate very substantially. And we met them only halfway. The finance minister drew the line and he said, I'm not going to agree to anything above 12%, let's say. I think it was 12.5% then. So to accommodate that view of the finance minister, they lowered their inflation projection, right? So we all knew, as the principal economic advisor, I'd given my outlook of inflation to be around 14% in 2009. The State Bank of Pakistan had given their inflation outlook of between 13.5% to 14%. But this was inconsistent with what they had accommodated or agreed from the finance minister of the policy rate not increasing beyond 12%, right? So in their program documents and in the report to the executive board, they showed inflation at 9.5%. That's the only way it was consistent with not increasing the policy rate over 12%, right? So it all depends. Sometimes it's a political. So in the program documents, when you look at the inflation paths that the IMF reworked in March this year, not too long ago, as late as March this year, the inflation path is declining. And the only reason it is doing that is because the IMF staff cannot go back to the executive board and say that we've allowed the State Bank of Pakistan to bring down the policy rate, and yet we see inflation rising in Pakistan, right? So the executive board is going to take the IMF staff to task because they will say this is an inconsistent view or you've introduced an inconsistency in the program. if your inflation outlook is increasing, then you have to make sure the authorities in Pakistan increase the policy rate. You can't have both things. So therefore, at this point in time, the IMF is viewing inflation in Pakistan just like the State Bank of Pakistan, which is as a temporary spike, and they expect this to come down. My view and the view of some other independent economists is this is not a temporary spike. It's unfortunately going to be here for a while, and the budget will add to inflationary pressures. And therefore, at some stage, the State Bank of Pakistan will be forced to increase the policy rate once again.
Thank you, sir. Sir, the next question is from Eamon, who is a student of Bachelor's of Economics. Her question is that this question is not related to today's session, but I want to ask related to FATF situation, as Pakistan is still in grey list, despite the fact that officials said in previous meeting that country will be out of the list. Does this has actually to do something with the relation of country with the US in the current Afghan-US situation?
You know, it's obviously there's no smoking gun, but this is all conjecture or speculation, and it certainly seems to be the case, and I certainly believe it. I think as a Pakistani, my DNA is towards conspiracy theories, so I also believe in this conspiracy theory that certainly the US has asked FATF to keep Pakistan on the grey list. But then one part of me also is a bit objective. And I think if you just look at the objective criteria, the fact is that Pakistan did not meet a very important, conditionality that we agreed to on money laundering and combating financing for terrorism. So EML, CFT. We were short on one or two of these. One of the most important of these criteria that we were not meeting was not the law. We had done a lot in terms of the legislation. Unfortunately, as is always the case in Pakistan, we were very wide off the mark in terms of implementation. So there were 372 or thereabouts cases of investigations of money laundering and only one prosecution. So I think we also need to be a bit fair and objective and say, look, the US, we gave the chance to the US to allow, to keep us on the grey list. But if our relations with the US were better, certainly I think the US would have looked the other way and would have leaned on the FATF countries to get Pakistan back on the white list. So at one degree, at one level, it's certainly something to do with the relationship with the US. At another level, we can argue that we could have done more to make sure that the US did not have that reason to keep us on the grey list.
Thank you very much, sir. I would like to invite Dr. Bushra Yasmeen, coordinator for the webinar, for her concluding remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Faiza. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us again. It's always very informative and pleasure listening to you. And thanks for providing the insight of current budget sustainability with respect to IMF program. Now we are better aware of what are the budget constraints, where are there variations, and what can be the way forward. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining. Stay tuned for next webinars on budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.